Blue Horse Theatre 2025.
Welcome, my friends, to the Blue Horse Theatre. Now playing Fort Washington at Cincinnati, Part 3, by Robert Ralston Jones, 1902.
The shores of the Ohio River in front of Fort Washington rose rather steeply to a terrace about 55 feet above low water, which extended for some distance east and west. This terrace was the land first built upon when Cincinnati was settled, but the ground was not sufficiently elevated to ensure it against overflow by the freshets of winter and spring. This lower terrace extended back from the top of the riverbank about 450 feet, being terminated on the north by a second bank, which rose precipitously some 30 feet higher. Fort Washington stood upon the second terrace, which extended back from the upper edge of the second bank, at an elevation of between 80 and 90 feet above low water in the Ohio River. The lower terrace was originally covered by a growth of white walnut, water maples, hickory, and ash trees, with a few very large sycamores. One of these sycamores, situated near Deer Creek a little above its mouth, was hollow and of such a great size that a woman who acted as laundress about 1786 for the garrison at Fort Washington occupied it as a dwelling. The broken end of a hollow limb, which projected from the trunk, being utilized as a chimney.
Footnote 23. Recollections of Samuel Stitt, Cincinnati in 1859, by Charles Sist, page 145. Let's look a little bit deeper into this footnote and start on Sist's introduction on page 144 of Charles Gist's book, and then to hear the words of Samuel Stitt that Mr. Gist recorded.
Pioneer Recollections taken in 1845.
Samuel Stitt, who died in 1847 at the advanced age of 78 years, was born in the county of Down, Ireland in 1769. At the age of 20, he left his native country and went to America, landing at New York, where he remained until 1796, and in May of that year reached Cincinnati, which became his final resting place. He settled on the riverbank, upon the spot now occupied with the warehouses of Thurkield and Company and Schoenberger and Company. He bought of John Riddle in 1800, the lot I refer to, 60 feet by 200 with a double frame for $1,200. After holding it for 33 years, he leased it in 1833 on perpetual lease at $1,200 per annum. The property had been bought by Colonel Riddle of Scott Traverse for $67.67 at the close of 1790. The following disjointed notes I took down from Mr. Stitt's lips several years since.
Facing the river at the time I came was entirely a bluff bank, the surface being cleared, excepting a large elm tree east of what is now Commercial Row, from which for several years the martins took their departure. It stood many years until struck by lightning, when it was cut down to keep it from setting on fire the adjacent houses. There was a large cove opposite Griffin Yateman's at the mouth of Sycamore Street. This cove and Joel Williams, now Latham's Corner, were the principal landings. There was another cove at Ludlow Street. An old woman named Wright, who did washing for the garrison, had a cabin at this cove and was obliged to remove to the upper bank when the river was high. There was a duck and snipe pond 100 feet across where Walker kept store, reaching halfway to Sycamore Street. A post and rail fence extended along Main from Columbia Street, which, in extremely wet weather, was our only means of getting on foot to the hill. There was no horse path at this period up the hill on Main Street, which was a bluff gravel bank, and it required a pretty active man to climb it. But there was a cow path up Broadway and a very steep wagon road up Sycamore Street. The timber was all cut down on the town plat in 1796, when I first saw it. Gibson had a frame house at the corner of Main and Front Streets in which he kept store. D.C. Cooper, who afterward laid out Dayton, had the opposite corner, now Bates's, which he rented of Israel Ludlow. There were no other houses between Front and Columbia Streets, except a few one-story frames. At Mitchell's Corner there was an uninhabited log house. G.O. Gordon kept tavern above Resor's, and there was no other house on that side toward 2nd Street. All up to the corner was a pasture lot, belonging to and occupied by Israel Ludlow. William Ramsey kept store where Kilgore and Taylor have since, at the corner of the alley below Main Street. Isaac Anderson and Samuel Dick owned and occupied the lots west of Front as far as Walnut Street. William McCann kept tavern at Liverpool's corner. Freeman, the printer, resided between Walnut and Vine Streets. Martin Baum, William Ramsey, and myself clubbed together and paid $1 per year to a man for mowing down the gypsum weeds in front of the houses on the public landing. We all had our pasture lots. Mine was on Deer Creek, a little north of Fox's sawmill. On this lot was a large hollow sycamore tree, which was occupied as a dwelling by a woman who washed for the garrison. A large limb had been broken off, and the stump of it left served for a chimney. It was as much blacked by the smoke as any brick chimney I have seen since.
Those were the words of Samuel Stitt and his description of the Fort Washington area in 1796. Now back to our story.
The second terrace, also heavily wooded, back to the hillsides, which on 3 sides hemmed it in. There were a few white oak and poplar trees, but the forest growth consisted mostly of black and red oaks, hickory, beech, ash, and black walnut. Another footnote, sir. Would you like to read that one then, Mr. Blue Horse Manager? Number 24?
Yes, thank you, dear. For the pleasure of the audience. Footnote 24. Correspondence. From Judge Matson to Charles Sist. Date October 4th, 1845. North Bend, Ohio. Topic: Cincinnati in 1794.
Sir, in reply to your inquiry what kind of timber first covered the site of Cincinnati, I can state my recollections, which are very distinct on the subject. The bank of the river had a heavy growth of beech trees, many of them very large. At Hobson's Choice, on the river west of Western Row, the encampment of General Wayne, they were cut down and the stumps dug out, over so much of the bank as to make a parade ground, some of the largest being left standing adjacent for purposes of shade. Where the swamp came in between the riverbank and foot of the hill was a growth of white walnut, soft maple, white elm, shellbark hickory, and white ash. On the second table of Cincinnati was spread a variety of timber, such as beech, ash, black walnut, hickory, black and red oak, generally of vigorous growth. Here and there, white oak and poplar interspersed the rest. A space of perhaps 150 acres north and west of Barr's dwelling down to Stonemetz's Ford, on Mill Creek, was filled with poplar and beech. Of the latter there is, as you know, a small grove still standing, and called Loring's Woods. This is the only relic of the original growth of Cincinnati, except scattered trees. An abundant growth of spicewood was the undergrowth. They grew so thick that out at North Bend, after cutting off the bush and digging the roots loose, I have not been able, unassisted, to lift the clump out of the ground. For 3 or 4 years prior to the year 1794, there had been a large scope of outlots, as they were called, in a worm fence enclosure extending from about 6th Street north to Court Street, and from Main Street west to the section line, which nearly follows the line of what is now John Street. There was hardly a building on that space. I recollect but one, a small frame building on Main Street, on the St. Clair Square, between 7th and 8th. This had been put up by Thomas Godey, a lawyer of that period, as an office, but was not occupied as such, being found too much out of town for business purposes. In May of that year, one of the occupants of the enclosure, being engaged in burning brush at the west end of it, the fire accidentally spread over the whole clearing, fastening on the deadened timber which had been girdled and was by this time as dry as timber could become. The wind was from the west and was very high, which was what first caused the conflagration, and the sapwood as it burned peeled off in very large flakes, spreading the fire farther and farther east until it reached to the Main Street front. It may easily be imagined what a magnificent sight was presented by more than 100 acres of dry timber in flames. The whole population was engaged, as far as practicable, in saving the rails, of which in fact but few escaped. On Godey's office, 3 or 4 men were stationed, while buckets of water were handed up to them from time to time. As this was the first fire in Cincinnati, so it was the most extensive, as respects the space it covered. It compelled the settlers to clear the outlots much sooner than they would have done to get rid of the partially burnt timber left standing unsafely, or lying on the ground in the way of putting in the corn crop, for which they were preparing at the time. Yours, John Matson. North Bend, October 4th, 1845.
Fort Washington, standing there upon the second terrace, quite above the reach of the highest floods in the Ohio River, looked down upon the little hamlet which had already begun to spread out upon the lower plain. The fort was sufficiently removed from the edge of the upper bank to leave an esplanade from 60 to 80 feet in width, extending along its entire front. The great gateway of the fort opened upon this esplanade, which may have been used as a drilling ground for small bodies of troops. At the edge of bank, a picket fence extended along the esplanade. The ground surface of the lower terrace sloped back from the edge of the outer, or river bank, to the foot of the second bank, so that the water collected here in the winter, forming a skating pond which extended across Eastern Row, Broadway, and for a little distance north of Pearl Street. The picture presented by the fort from the riverside must have been quite imposing. Rising high above the river, with its blockhouses and barrack buildings 2 stories in height, connected by lines of high pickets. The whole white and glistening in the open sunlight, for the forest trees had been cleared away from about the fort. Fort Washington was a sight to gladden the heart of a weary voyager descending the Ohio, standing as it did, an emblem of the growing power of a young republic, and an earnest of that marvelous expansion through which the country has since passed. High above all else, from the mast within the quadrangle of the fort, floated a flag, then but little known or honored among nations, but now recognized and respected throughout the world.
Thank you for watching today. We will see you next time here at Blue Horse Theatre. Feel free to bring your own hot beverages and favourite biscuits. Farewell, my friends.
Blue Horse Theatre 2025